Thank you. So again, I'll start again. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Deeran, Director of Reform Scotland, the think tank, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our latest event, which is part of our NHS 2048 programme, which I hope you're aware of. And if you're not, look it up on our website. Lots of interesting reading on health reform, etc. there. And today's event is a discussion with Donald Macaskill, the Chief Executive of Scottish Care, which is the body that represents the independent social care sector. The current condition and future of Scotland's care sector is something that concerns all of us, both personally and as a broader society. I think it's fair to say that it's also clearly something that Scotland and the wider UK are not getting right at the moment. It's a huge political challenge, it's an economic challenge, it's a demographic challenge, and it's a moral challenge. But hard and complex as these challenges are, they are also challenges that must be met. And how to do so is the thorny question that faces us. We've seen various attempts over recent years at Westminster and Holyrood to address the issue. And so far, all of them have failed. In Scotland, we had the Feely report, and then we had the Scottish Government's bill to create a national care service. That bill hasn't survived contact with reality and has largely been hollowed out. Now the government is rethinking its care proposals. On top of all this, we've recently entered an era of reprioritised spending plans, which will lead inevitably to greater fiscal restraint on public service funding from politicians across Europe, including here at home. So how does this sit with the need to fund an effective care service? How do we maintain a large welfare state, an expensive NHS, a generous pension system, and fix social care? Where does the money come from? So we hope to explore all that and more over the next hour. Donald and I will have a chat, and then we'd very much like to hear your questions, which you can send using the chat function on Zoom, and feel free to have a conversation on there as the event goes on. We'll take as many of those as we can before we end. So Donald, thank you for your time today, and I'd just like to get into it really, and I think I'd like to start by asking you to provide something of an overview of the current condition of the care system in Scotland, if you're able to do that.
Chris, and thank you very much to Reform Scotland for the kind invitation to come here. I suppose you've described fairly well some of the challenges that we're facing, but explicitly at the moment, I think many of those on the call who know the world of social care will probably assess the current time to be one of particular challenge. And there's challenge on various fronts. One is, for instance, a challenge relating to the economic state of health and social care. Now, Scotland Audit Commission a couple of weeks ago produced a report detailing indebtedness to the level of over £400 million. Most commentators would argue you could probably add another 200 million to that. So that effectively means that integrated joint boards, that's the boards that are responsible for contracting and commissioning and in part delivering care and support to people in their own homes or indeed in residential settings, have a huge degree of indebtedness, which means that practically they're not able to purchase the care and support that citizens need. And we've seen that most dramatically since the start of this year, with 90% of our care home and home care members noticing that they've had to experience significant decrease in both the purchase of care home beds and also the purchase of, or the delivery and commissioning of care at home contracts. Now, that's a systemic problem, which is a matter of real urgency, but what it means on the front line is that women and men who are desperate to receive care and support simply cannot access a care home, or they cannot get the package of care that they need. And that's putting a huge burden on our community, and not least on our unpaid and family carers. But because it's invisible, by and large, these aren't people queuing up outside our hospitals and forming a queue of literally thousands of individuals. It's out of sight and it's out of mind. So the economic challenge is a fundamental one, and it's been made worse and will be made worse in a couple of weeks' time by the fact that the UK government, in some sort of cloud cuckoo land economic strategy, decided that it would be a good idea to change the employer's national insurance requirements on all organisations, be they charitable, not-for-profit, or indeed private social care, hospices, GPs, etc. I think people don't quite realize just how cataclysmic that decision will be. And in part, it will mean within a very short period of time, and I'm talking 3 months, we will have many organizations simply not able to, for cash flow reasons, deliver care and support. That's not because people don't need it, it's because they will not have the economic flexibility to sustain themselves. And the banks and other lending sources simply will not touch the sector at this time because of the economic uncertainty. So those are two, one medium and one immediate long-term economic challenge. And the other huge area remains workforce. But I don't want to keep talking and depressing everybody. I'll keep the workforce depression for a few moments. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you for that. That's a fairly gloomy opening statement, I guess. And you mentioned that 90% of your members are seeing a decrease in purchase of care home beds and contracts. What is the consequence of this for the people, the end user, the person who needs care?
Well, it's very dramatic, Chris. It effectively means that if you've been assessed as requiring care and support, which needs to be undertaken in a residential or in a nursing care home place, and you cannot, first of all, get an assessment, and we're hearing some absolutely nonsensical arguments. For instance, I hope everybody in this call knows that it's your right in legislation to get an assessment under the free personal and nursing care legislation. We're hearing from some authorities that because they can't effectively buy the care home bed or the package of care necessary to meet that need, they're not carrying out the assessments in the first place. And that effectively means if you're not carrying out those assessments, then you're effectively meaning anybody who wants to self-fund their care in their own home or in a care home isn't able to do that. So it's a double whammy on the part of individuals looking for care and support, because if they need the help of the state, they're not getting it. If they can manage to pay for it themselves, they can't access it in its fullness because they want the free personal and nursing care element. So critically, it means for people in their communities that when they're desperately needing the care and support that will keep them healthy and well, and in many instances will enable them to spend the last few months of their lives being properly supported, with their family prioritizing their presence rather than their care, they wouldn't be able to and are not able to access this. And as a report a few months ago highlighted, we are seeing hundreds of individuals dying whilst waiting to be assessed.
So from what you're saying, despite the importance of social care, it's a major political issue these days. We talk about it all the time. The politicians talk about it all the time, but it's not only not getting better, it's not only trundling along in its current condition, it's getting worse.
Undeniably. And, you know, it's interesting you should say we talk about it all the time, but actually that's all that we do. We have political leadership, which some part of it recognizes this as an issue, but other parts of our political leadership, both nationally and locally, recognize this as a discomforting truth, but actually it's not a priority because it's not a priority for the people who elect and the people who vote. Now, I think that is grossly to fail to recognize that there is a symbiotic relationship between the National Health Service and social care. If we get social care right, if we recognize as it is that social care can be an economic driver and contributor, then what we do is that we stop people needing to have early intervention through hospital treatment. We stop people being blocked in hospital because there's no package of care for them in the community. And we prevent unnecessary admission and waiting lists in terms of accident and emergency. The problem is all the political attention, regardless of government or opposition, is focused on the big ticket item, not least delayed discharge, without recognizing that if you get social care right, even if you start to get social care right, then you start to get delayed discharge right. But if you attend to one part of the system, the NHS, and particularly the acute and secondary NHS, without focusing equal resource and priority on social care, then we'll be talking about this in 5, 10, 15 years' time, except we'll be counting the number of people who have died waiting for care, which is their right.
And at the start of your answer there, you touched on quite an important issue that doesn't really get talked about, which is the role that social care plays as a contributor to the Scottish economy. And you and I had a bit of a chat about this previously, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something like the fourth largest contributor as a sector to the economy, just under tourism and above agriculture and fisheries. Is that right?
That's right, Chris. So a independent report just out 2.5 weeks ago, highlighted that social care contributes, this is contribution to the Scottish economy, £5.2 billion, which effectively means the socio-economic return you get for every pound you invest in social care, you get £2 back. There are very few sectors as big, as economically contributed as social care, and yet all the narrative is a drain, a deficit, a cost on the Scottish economy. And I love the fact that we've got an economic strategy in this country at the moment, and I've seen economic priorities of other political parties other than the one in government, and none of them use the language of social care being an economic driver, contributor, and engine, not least in the way in which social care, in terms of its innovation around technology, digital, and AI, is far ahead of many other sectors in the country. We've got to change the narrative from seeing social care as an inconvenience and a political irritation to seeing it as a priority to invest in.
Yeah, and another key factor which you touched on, maybe we could go into a bit more depth on it, is, if I can describe it, as the problem of the NHS. But when it comes to social care, the NHS does present something of a problem. It guzzles up money, all the available money. We know that it works okay in some places and sometimes not in others. It's the voters' and politicians' number one priority, or so they tell us. And yet, as you said, some of the difficulties it faces are caused by the state of the care sector not being able to unblock some of the blockages that we've seen. So at both ends, social care matters. Done well, it keeps people healthier in the first place, and keeps them out of hospital and in their residence. When it's done badly, it adds to waiting lists, obviously. And then if people can't secure a care package when they're ready to leave hospital or a place, they have to stay there beyond the period that they clinically need to. Again, delayed discharge puts pressure on waiting lists and affects these individuals badly. So we can't really fix the NHS without fixing care, can we?
No, and Reform Scotland's great programme of blogs and articles around the reform of the NHS is illustrative of the fact that if we're going to be around to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the NHS, if the NHS is going to be around, then we, in many senses, need radical reform. Not the sort of radical reform, I think, that gets on the front page of certain newspaper, which is really about structures and systems and processes. And obviously last week we've seen the removal of NHS England, which again is a process matter. But the radical reform, which from my perspective is a return to what the initial intention and origins of the NHS in the time of Bevan was all about. And if you look, as I have, at the legislation, the discussions, the committee debates in Parliament at that time, what we have envisioned then was a national health service rooted in community, primary care, community, and indeed social care, which was established in the modern sense at exactly the same time as the NHS, was all about enabling people to be supported and treated and well in their community, to remain independent as part of a community, to be enabled to be citizens. What we have seen in the decades since is the creation of what I call, unashamedly, without embarrassment, and I apologise to no one, a national hospital service. And we've lost that centrality of the community, of the neighbourhood. And from my perspective, primary care, general practice, and social care have failed to be the primary focus, and we've created an emphasis on hospital, acute, and secondary. Now, I'm not denying the importance of the latter, but I am arguing strongly that if there is a limited fiscal envelope, and we have to prioritise, it's time to stop prioritising maintaining our hospitals and start prioritising and maintaining and nurturing our communities, including through social care.
And that raises a word that has come up a lot during our NHS 2048 programme. That word is prevention, which takes us back to the Christie principles, which are often talked about but don't ever seem to have been acted upon over the last sort of 12 or 13 years, however long it's been since that report came out. We've really seemed unable to move the dial on prevention, although we talk about it incessantly. Why do you think it's so hard to make that shift and really start to try to keep people healthier and put less of a burden on the National Hospital Service, as you describe it?
I think one of the reasons is undoubtedly economic, and the second reason is political. Now, if I look at what's happening in Australia, and I've written a little bit about this because I spent 5 days, and I know that's not enough to discover the truth of a whole nation, but there is dramatic activity happening in a reconception of health and social care, particularly for older people in Australia. But equally, if I look at terms of what's happening in Denmark and what is beginning to happen in the Republic of Ireland, we see a very deliberate agreement to invest significant fiscal resource into social care, community care, primary care as a preventative tool. And without that resource, and that whether you take it away from secondary or you add additional investment, enables you to jumpstart a preventative system which prevents people going into hospital, which treats them and supports them where close to home or indeed in their own home. I think the second reason, in addition to the economic, is undeniably political. The Australian model was because there was astonishing political cross-party consensus in which individual ministers and politicians put their heads on the line and said, actually, this is far more important than the short-termism of elected office. And I think we need that in the United Kingdom. And good luck to Baroness Casey in terms of her work in England. We had that opportunity in Scotland because I have never experienced the degree of consensus as existed around Derek Feely, very similar to the consensus that existed previously around Christie. And somehow or other, we've managed to contrive to corrupt consensus into a dog's breakfast, which has now led us to the pathetic state of non-reform reform that we have here at the moment.
And how would you describe your own mood when you look at the possibility of cross-party collaboration? This is clearly an issue that won't be solved without it. It just can't happen because it's too big and it would require too much buy-in from across the place. We've got an election obviously coming up next year for Holyrood, which adds in all sorts of disincentives to come together and fix things as kind of one society. How optimistic are you at the moment that is something that can be achieved in the near future, or whatever timescale you think might be more likely?
So contrary to appearances, I do tend to be an optimist. And that is partly because the alternative is just nightmarish. The alternative is all those thousands of individuals not getting the care and support they need, and us continuing not to have a national health service, but to have a national hospital service. So I do think there is a willingness across all of the political parties, maybe not at leadership level at the moment, because of the clear challenges of elections coming round the corner. But I think we've got to start now working to gain a civic consensus which enables and encourages and gives confidence to our political leadership to try to think about doing things differently and asking some really uncomfortable questions and coming up with answers which have to go beyond the political cycle, not least how are we going to pay and afford both health and social care in the future.
And obviously the Scottish Government, in a sense, may lack a sense of confidence at the moment because it had its own plan for a national care service. It had a bill, still has a bill that's going through Holyrood, but has been hollowed out, is the expression I keep seeing used. And the criticism of the National Care Service seemed to me to resolve around two main issues. That one, that it wasn't properly costed in advance, which made it very hard to analyse really effectively by committees, etc. And that it was too centralising a blueprint, which didn't go down well with local government and third sector people. What was your view of the plan as it stood initially, and also what about the bill as it now stands? If you could cover both of those areas.
So personally, I think the failure to properly embed Feely was a huge missed opportunity. And, you know, it is an astonishing giftedness to manage to turn consensus into what we ended up with. And I think we've got to learn the lessons of who has responsibility for that. Because there was consensus initially, and you know, the language of co-design is used, but you can only co-design if you have everybody around the table. People were not around the table. I think some of the fault lines, which then became absolute chasms, could have been healed with a degree of consensual debate early on. There was a failure to enable that to be truly inclusive. In the future, and one of the lessons again from Australia is that everybody needs to be in the room. You cannot make presumption and priority, which excludes critical voices. But the truth of Feely remains, and I agree with my colleagues in the disability rights and in the third sector. We have a postage lottery of social care provision around Scotland. What's happening in Stranraer today is not the same as what's happening in Stornoway or in Selkirk. We have a contradictory system of competitive tendering effectively. And we need to move towards something which is about ethical commissioning, which prioritises the individual at the heart of the care and support. So all the bricks for the creation of a process are there. We need to work collaboratively. And I think we could have overcome the critical issue of centralisation and governance if there was more trust in the system. But that clearly, I do find at the moment the idea of calling what we have before Parliament a care reform bill a bit farcical. I mean, who are you kidding? There's not reform here. There's a movement in certain technical areas, some of which may be positive and some of which undoubtedly are questionable. And I'm really pleased that Anne's Law has managed to be salvaged, and I hope it will go through, but we need to decouple some of the elements of this bill. I think we have allowed a parliamentary process and a system of internal governance at government, not necessarily ministers, to corrupt the vision of Feely. And the sooner we get back to that vision of collaborative, human rights-based changes to social care delivery to enable consistency and to remove the power imbalance where the person receiving care and support doesn't feel as if they're in control.
And how would you see the correct balance between control from the centre, or whatever it should be from the centre, local government, the individual, obviously, the private sector, the third sector? There are all sorts of different moving parts in this, but given that criticism of centralisation, what do you think the role should be for the centre, and how much power should be left at a local and personal level?
Again, looking at what's happening both in Denmark and in Australia, there is a resistance towards centralisation, but you only give up the power from the local to the centre if you have a sense of ownership and influence on that central decision. And it is through that central role that we enable the consistency, the address and the correctives to some of what is inconsistent and a lottery, as it's called, at local level. So what I would like to have seen is a much more enhanced autonomy for local boards, much as we have in terms of NHS boards, and to enable that to feed up into a central body which would have been more collaborative, which would have been chaired independently, not necessarily ministerially or politically. Because after all, as one of the disability rights group has said, this is far too important to be left to politicians. It's important that these roles are chaired, influenced and occupied by real citizens. And I'm not suggesting, before anybody suggests that I'm suggesting our political leaders are somehow from outer space. Or maybe
well, maybe many of us wouldn't disagree with that. But just thinking about the political direction of this, and the parties are obviously starting to think about the manifestos ahead of next year. You know, we talk to them as a think tank. I'm sure you're talking to them as well about this issue. Do you have any sense of where the government is going now that it's almost recalled its social care strategy? Are there any sort of anything coming out from there or from the opposition parties about which are they starting to understand the issues that you've raised and maybe address those in the way that you'd like to see, or is it radio silence at the moment? What's the state of play?
Yeah, I don't. I would love to be Mystic Meg, Chris, but I don't have a crystal ball in terms of what the current government is thinking. I would really like all our political parties, as they're beginning to formulate ideas moving towards the election, to try to work collaboratively with all stakeholders, be they people who use support, provide them, the workforce, the trade unions, local and national delivery agents, because we can't allow this to continue to be the party political football, because it should be a political, cultural, and societal priority. And so, if all that we're going to do is each of the political parties aligning their own position in order to be different from others, we're going to have an even greater hurdle to overcome in 2026. There is an opportunity for political consensus. I recognise, I'm not naive, that there will be divergence in manifestos, but there are areas where we could work collaboratively even before then to provide the framework for some sort of consensual approach, both to health and to social care. At the moment, I think the current Scottish government is happy to conclude what's on the statute as quickly as possible, and some of that's really important. Though some of it, I think, is maybe a hostage to fortune in part.
And you've mentioned a number of countries where they are trying to get to grips with this. So you mentioned Australia, you mentioned Ireland, you mentioned Denmark. Again, in an earlier conversation we had, you were talking about Wales being further ahead than certainly Scotland on this. Could you just talk a bit about the Welsh experience at present?
Well, the Welsh experience is they've used the language of a National Care Service. It's something which the Labour government in Wales has pushed forward with. They have a very clearly defined model of what we started to call ethical commissioning in Scotland, where there's a priority on people. There's a diversity of business models because, people often forget certainly close to 78 to 80% of social care delivery in this country is not delivered by either local or national government. It's delivered by charitable, third sector, private, and in Scotland, free of Europe's largest employee-owned social care provision. So there is a desire, I think, in Wales changing regulation to work collaboratively, because at the end of the day, and one of the reasons the National Care Service did appeal to me is that the person who opens their door to a care worker in the morning or in the evening doesn't actually care who employs that worker. What they care about is the sense of continuity that they have in relationship. What they care about is that they're getting a care and support which is not on the clock, where the worker's in for 15 minutes and thinking about where they need to be. Or since January this year, we've seen the obscenity of a growth in 5-minute home care visits. What they care about in terms of their care home is a consistency of quality of care. And if they are a self-funder, that they don't feel that the state is ripping off them because the state chooses to pay £1,000 a week less than it's a fair price of care.
And you talked about the workers there, the people that the door is opened to, and we can't have this conversation without talking about the workforce, which we hear a lot about, terms and conditions. We hear a lot about the strain that people are working under. You mentioned the 15-minute visits, the 5-minute visits. What is the reality on the ground at present if you are a care service worker?
The reality is that we're 5 years on, almost to the day, since the pandemic. And at that time, we stood, many of us, and we clapped and we applauded our care workers, like our NHS colleagues, for the amazing, sacrificial, courageous work that they did, because we've forgotten just how terrifying it was in those first few weeks. But we've not followed through in anything other than rhetoric. Yes, the Scottish Government has, unlike other parts of the United Kingdom, continued to fund the national living wage, but they haven't funded differentials. So the gap between a frontline worker and a supervisor is virtually negligible now. And yes, we have improved through some of our work on Fair Work and done work around the next stages of that. But I always fall back on the truth, which is today there will be an advert in the Edinburgh newspapers or in the Glasgow newspapers for a dog walker. And that advert will carry more money per hour to walk a dog than somebody who has to be registered, who is regulated, who has to be qualified, will get for caring for somebody in the joy of their living and in supporting that person at the end of life. I know, because I have been and spent so much time with care workers, that this is the most rewarding, human fulfilling role imaginable. There are very few jobs that you start the day and by the end of it, you know you've changed the lives of somebody. But we are not rewarding, we're not recognizing, we're not remunerating the amazing women and men. And at the moment, we will continue to hemorrhage, we will continue to have burnout amongst this workforce, and we will continue, unfortunately, to lose them. And our other avenues, such as international recruitment, have just in the last 2 or 3 weeks become impossible, courtesy of the Home Office and a rather inability to recognise that on the one hand that you need social care services, but let's close the opportunity for social care employers to recruit internationally.
Well, that's very, very worrying. Can you explain why this lack of esteem or lack of status exists in a profession that is so important to our society and that really speaks to the better angels of human nature, if you like? You'd think it'd be one of the areas that actually people would truly value, those who give up their time to help others that are in desperate need.
Yeah, it's difficult to imagine the answer to that question. I had the privilege to serve on the Fair Work Commission around social care. And I think both academically and in terms of the work that sociologists have done, we can't escape the conclusion that we're in the midst here of discrimination, where the 86% of workers who are female working in social care actually male. I don't think we'd be in the situation that we're in at the moment. And I know that may sound simplistic, but you know, a week or so on from International Women's Day, we cannot we cannot get away from the genderized nature of care and support, the presumption that somehow or other, if this is a natural task for women or instinctively female, it must be low skilled, non-technical and non-professional. And the truth is the absolute opposite. These are highly skilled, technical, humanistic roles. And somehow or other, we have always, as a culture, as a society, considered those roles to be of lesser value and economic contribution. We know, however, the truth in our communities and in our own homes. But that truth has not influenced the way in which we, as societies and cultures, have chosen to prioritize our resource. Until we start to do that, until we start to value care as all people's work and award and remunerate appropriately, we'll always be pushing a bus uphill.
Okay, just another few questions from me, and then I'll open it up to the floor. Like most conversations these days, you can't get through it without discussing tech and AI and the impact that's going to have as time passes. I believe that this is exactly the kind of sector that technology can have quite transformative impacts on. Is that happening already, and how do you see the future of the care sector as tech and AI develops?
So it is happening already, and there's some breathtaking uses of tech in general and some of the AI supported at the moment. And we're seeing this in individuals' own homes. My own organization has innovated in different parts of the country a role called the care technologist, which is about training people to use in-home tech, which enables people to be independent, I shouldn't advertise, but things like Amazon Echo Dot and other devices. There are other devices from other organizations, but the use of such technology, particularly technology which enables people to remain independent and connected at the same time, reminding technology is hugely significant and is becoming more significant. I know from having spoken to colleagues and work I've been doing elsewhere that by the summer it's likely that at least two major developers will have available for the market AI devices which will enable with an astonishing degree of accuracy to predict the likelihood of a fall occurring. And as anybody knows, falls in your own home or in a residential setting or in a clinical hospital setting are hugely significant for the person themselves and expensive to respond to clinically and in terms of care. Every week I'm hearing of something new. I've just had the privilege of chairing an Oxford University coordinated group which has just drawn up a set of ethical principles for the use of AI in healthcare and in social care, and that launches next week. So it's here, it's going to contribute, but it will not replace. It's to be utilized. Both technology and AI devices and AI systems will enable efficiency and it will enable better response and critically give people a sense of independence and control, which they often lack. But we will always need humans and we will always need the people to enable the best use of such devices. So yes, I think social care, and in this regard, unashamedly, Scotland is perhaps a little bit ahead of the game. But we have to invest in it, we have to recognise its value, and we have to better resource.
And at the heart of everything you've been saying, we always come back to investment and funding, and that's the big issue we haven't really talked about yet. As I said at the start, the fiscal climate has changed even in the last month due to the international situation. So we've got a government at Westminster that's now looking at cutting the foreign aid budget, it's looking at cutting the welfare budget, it's looking at trimming the civil service. And sadly, this isn't to fund a massive investment in social care, it's to fund the defence budget and to protect some of the other budgets that they see as being essential. So looking at doing social care properly, it's not cheap. In fact, it's very expensive. We're going to struggle to fund it from within existing budgets, the way things are going. And, the fact is there is a big reprioritisation of public spending at the moment and not necessarily in ways that will be helpful. We've suggested at Reform Scotland that it would perhaps take something like a social insurance scheme, certainly as part of the mix, so that you can create new funding streams. And what's your view of what the right path to go down on this is? What's a realistic path, maybe rather than an idealistic path?
I think a realistic path has to be a contributive system. We will. I'm old enough to remember when national insurance contributed the majority of the resource which was taken for our health and social care system. People like my parents, grandparents, that's what they paid into. There's still that myth out there, but it is just a myth. On its own, our current tax system, even if we increased to the point at which we were on the edge before we begin to affect economic contribution, even if we increased, that would not be sufficient. So I do look to countries like Germany and the continent, not least to the north of Europe and Norway and Denmark and Sweden, in which it's recognised as a core part of your role as a citizen that you need to make savings through insurance, through direct systems, through increased local taxation to pay for your own social care. So a mixed methodology, I think, is inevitably going to have to result. That's not going to be popular. I think obviously Baroness Casey has started to do some of that work. Well, she will start. She's doing other work at the moment, but that's not going to come about until 2028, I think, when her financial and her resource part of her work will complete. We need to, in Scotland, start thinking about this. We need to start having conversations with our citizenship, because at the moment, we simply cannot continue into the future to pay for what we're paying. And that may involve uncomfortable language. Can we continue to have free prescriptions? Can we continue to have free personal care when actually most of us recognise it's only small elements of free personal care? Now, I'm a universalist. I've written about how I think the distinctiveness of social care in Scotland, not least since the 1968 Act, was about citizenship and enabling somebody to be healthy in community, not a healthy individual. I wouldn't want us to lose sight of the benefits and the sheer economic contribution which comes from a universalist approach. But if we're going to keep that on the one hand, we're going to have to recognise we need to change responsibilities and payment on the other hand. Otherwise, the two will simply not add up.
Okay. Well, there's a few comments on the chat board, and I'd like to invite maybe some of the people there to put their points to Donald. Jean Knowles, you've made a few comments. Would you like to put them to Donald or have a question or whatever? Are you with us, Jean? Okay.
Hello,
okay. Well, maybe.
hi.
Oh, there we are. Hello. That's all right.
I just, fear that you've got people who the hospital system has assessed as being appropriate for social care, but the absence of a mechanism for social care to do, as it were, an in-house assessment also means that the social care provider is missing out on a temporary placement and the income that would accrue from that. What would you feel about that being a two-way door that, care homes could temporarily accept somebody and do in-house assessment rather than having to wait and, have an empty room and, which is in a sense staffed but not used?
Thank you, Jean. So there's a lot of merit in that, and in the good old days, actually, some parts of Scotland, that's what we actually did. So there are examples, for instance, in Aberdeenshire, Aberdeen, if I can remember, where, and to a certain extent in Highland, where individual social care organisations were involved in the assessment in the hospital, so it sped up that process and prevented what we often see at the moment, which is somebody's assessed and the assessment isn't contextually sufficiently sensitive, so that when they go back to their own home or indeed into a residential environment, their needs and their particular support isn't fit for purpose. So we also have what are called step-down facilities, which enable somebody to be discharged from hospital as quickly as possible. Because we all know that if you're healthy, a hospital's not the healthiest place to be. If you're fit for discharge, it's best to get out as quickly as possible. So if you get stepped down to a care home, that enables the assessment to be more rounded. Either you then go back into your own home or you remain in that care home or are transferred elsewhere. But without going back into the thorny area of money, step-down facilities are much more expensive to maintain because you have a higher level of staffing. You often have staff with clinical and nursing skills which are more advanced than those who might be available. So it is a model that works. It's one that, for instance, again, is much utilised in Australia with real success, but it is not a cheap alternative. But then again, if it costs roughly around about £1,900 per week to maintain somebody in an NHS bed with no treatment, it is significantly cheaper to support that person in a residential environment, or indeed, as we've seen more recently, hospital at home.
Jean, do you want to come back in just quickly on that?
Yes, and what I was going to say is also there's the issue about in rural areas, there seems to be disproportionate closing of care homes and people then having to be in hospitals in a more central location so that they're further disconnected from the family and from any hope of return to the community.
Yeah, and been speaking quite a bit recently, Gina, and my own family heritage is an island one, and I know that in the island that I came from, we used to have about a dozen care homes. We've now got three. And if they happen to be full, individuals have to travel a huge distance. But we've got huge issues in our rural communities over social care in general. And one of those, and the primary one, is actually workforce. How do you attract, retain people in community? And I'm not sure if I'm allowed to advertise, but the BBC Yorpa programme had a really good programme last week looking at and exploring social care in the Highlands and Islands. And one of the issues they touched upon is a critical one, and that is housing. I know of a provider who got an experienced nurse to consider and think and start to move into a rural community in the Highlands, but there was no house available for that person. So we need a whole system approach through housing, through community provision, through health and social care, particularly in our remote areas. And to my mind, we need to introduce something called a Highland or a rural remote waiting, as we do in London. It's more expensive to deliver, regardless of the model of care and support that you have, and we need to incentivise people through housing, through additional salary, and other additional benefits.
I'd like to. I see Chris Cregan's with us, and there's someone who has thought a lot about systems and structures when it comes to the care sector. Chris, you've made a point here. Would you like to make it to us now?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Hi, Donald.
Hi, Chris.
Good to see you. This is probably going to sound like I'm splitting hairs a little bit, Donald, but I wanted you to tease something out. So you talked earlier on about about structures and systems and processes as if they were a kind of a wanna. And I think, but I actually think, and as you know, I've been working closely with CCPS and more recently supporting work in dialogue with your own organisation on this for a number of years now. I think there's a really important distinction to be drawn between structural change, and you can argue that what's happened and the failure to respond to Feely correctly has been an over-focus on structural change. Indeed, the previous Cabinet Secretary for Health has said as much herself, and she was the person who commissioned Derek Feely. But I think you can argue there's an important distinction between structural change and system change, and actually that we do need system change, but that system change needs to be predicated on something that you've talked about there, which I would describe as subsidiarity to the level of the individual. So you start with the individual, not with the centre, and if you start with that principle in terms of system change around the individual, that will determine what needs to happen at the centre, what needs to happen locally in terms of commissioning and so on. So I just wondered if you could tease that out a little more.
Sorry, Chris. I think you've described it extremely well yourself. What I would add is something that I wrote in the reform piece I did for Reform Scotland, which is I think we've got a real potential for the democratisation of social care. So I am, to be honest, I'm less concerned about structural change. I know our political anoraks love that stuff. What I am concerned about is the experience of the individual. And, I'm old enough to be one of the first to have been involved in introducing person-centred thinking and personalisation into Scotland all those eons ago, a world you're very familiar with, Chris. And I think we've got real potential, not least with tech and AI, to really give the citizen control, choice, to enable her or him to be the commissioner, the contractor of their care and support. And I don't just mean through personal payments, because we've made a mess of self-directed support as a country, but to try to get some of the potential of social care is about system change. It's enabling flexibility that enables the citizen to be the customer and the consumer in charge of their care and support. I think there's a real potential for us to do that, which is about rights embedding, and it is about control over personal budgets. And we've not really gone there in the adventurous, creative ways that I think we possibly can. That will require significant change in terms of local governance and also in terms of local delivery through care providers who are able to offer that sort of flexibility. Maybe I'm a dreamer, but it's no harm in dreaming.
Thank you. Richard Marsh, you've got a question about the allocation of resources, which seems a useful thing to touch on.
Yeah, it was just sorry for touching upon the fiscal point here, but yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think, but what struck me was we're constantly talking in these areas about the need to invest and to fund, and it's a compelling case, but it's a compelling case being made in the light of the NHS also making similar claims. So it will say for every pound you give the NHS, we return social value. And this is an NHS that is significantly larger, highly influential. And whilst it might recognize the benefits that the care sector will give it, the resources it might free up, it's less it's willing to enjoy the benefits of it, but I think it's less likely to let go of the resources. So do you need to make a case for saying resources really need to be reallocated? And it's a brave battle to take on, to extract that word free from prescriptions and all the other things that will be coming around in the election.
I think there's no alternative. Resources, if there ain't any more, then we've got to spend what we've got differently. And that means inevitably reallocation, and reallocation of resources inevitably not going to go down well with those who have had the ability and the enjoyment of ready access, even if it hasn't always felt ready access to those resources. So I think the resource should go to where the people are. So if we utilize that and where the greatest need is, then there are 2.5 times as many people today in a care home, regardless of who operates it. There are 5 times as many people receiving care and support in their own home compared to those who are in an NHS hospital. And there are 10 times, 12 times as many receiving care and support through primary and through general practice. I think we have to, and yet the balance of resource provision is massively in favour of the acute and secondary care. Now, I was told many years ago there is absolutely no point in a hospital saying we're going to save money by closing that unit or mothballing that ward, because the only way you save the money is to close the hospital. Now, I don't want to become a complete hate figure, but I think we have to think the unthinkable. If we're serious about people being well and being healthy in their space and place, in their own community or close to home, then that inevitably means we either reduce the resource we give to our hospital beast or we reorientate it. I remember, and I can't quite remember the names, but the consultant was a Sri Lankan consultant in mental health in Birmingham in the 1980s. And he looked around at all the patients who were coming to his ward in hospital. And he decided virtually overnight, but at least within a month, to stop holding clinics in the hospital and to close all the availability in-house and to transfer all that out into the community. It had a dramatic influence and impact on the treatment of mental health in the 80s in Birmingham. His next battle was, as he said, recognizing the social determinants and the economic determinants that influence mental health, whereby he started to address issues of poverty and housing and malnutrition. I said earlier that I'm passionate about the fact that we have brilliant legislation in this country. Part of that was the Social Work Scotland Act of 1968, which spoke about wellness and a citizen approach to people being supported. It took us away from the paternalistic idea that the state was there to come to rescue you, and it really was about giving more autonomy. If we're serious about that legislative foundation, it's time for us to take the risk, disinvest in the acute and secondary NHS, change the power balance where governance and structure is very much rooted with political appointees, and give more autonomy and control to citizens.
Thank you for that, Donald. Lucy Mulvey, you've got a slightly different point on investment. I wonder if you could share that with us.
Hi there. Yeah, hello. Sorry, I didn't realise I would go on camera. So I'm from the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland, a national third sector intermediary and membership organisation for health and care. We've been looking for quite some time now, as Donald knows, because I've had many discussions with him about this, at alternative economic models. So not just about looking at how do we divide this pie up differently from how we're already dividing it, but what are the ingredients that go into the pie in the first place? And some of the models that we've been looking at include things like equality and human rights budgeting. And we do know that Scottish Government are looking at that. They have Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group, but also particularly speaking to the point about the overwhelming discrimination that happens in social care because it is a primarily female-dominated workforce. The gender budgeting and the care economy work that is being done by colleagues at Scottish Women's Budget Group, amongst others. And then finally looking at the work of a relatively new fairer tax or tax justice network that has been set up by a number of organisations across Scotland, looking at how do we perhaps look at raising more tax in order to make the pot bigger in the first place. The first things around human rights budgeting, I think, would really primarily that's about if you're saying on paper and in legislation that something is a human right and you're wanting to achieve human rights, plus our country has signed up to international treaties saying that the state will respect, protect and fulfill human rights, then you need to take that approach when it comes to budgeting and resource allocation as well. And that's a way of looking at how do we actually divide up this pie in a fair, transparent and participatory way. So I just welcome any thoughts that Donald might have on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. And you will know that I've been an advocate for human rights budgeting for a long time, though I'm also increasingly cynical about the way in which the rhetoric of human rights has been used by many almost as a fig leaf for decisions which have been anything but human rights embedded and oriented. So I think there needs to be some real, and I agree with you, we can't just look at the shape of the cake or the size of the cake. We've got to look at the ingredients and to address the inequalities, which is why I'm supporting, along with many in this call, the idea that care should be a national priority. But what I'm probably increasingly concerned about is that even if we increase the size of cake in a more equitable, rights-based, gender-oriented way, the fundamental misuse of the resource that we have comes with the decisions made about how you prioritise the spend for that cake. And I suppose the one thing I'm increasingly convinced is that if we have to live in a world of shortened, limited resources, what matters most is what sort of world and society are we creating within those resources. And from my perspective, I think we need to fundamentally get around the table. And I'm only at one meeting, and I go to a hell of a lot of meetings in which NHS leadership and social care leadership and political leadership in Scotland sits together with organisations like Lucy's, the Alliance and others. There's only one meeting. Until we start talking to each other, we can't shape the way we spend our resource on a rights basis or in any other way. And for me, ultimately, the answer to that shaping has to give more autonomy, control to the citizen and not to the system, the structure or the process.
Thank you for that, Donald. And that takes us to our deadline. So I think we'll have to leave it there. Well, it's been a really fascinating and enlightening and alarming conversation, if I can put it that way, Donald. And so much food for thought around an issue that couldn't be more important. You've made the point that you remain an optimist somehow. I think after 30 years as a political journalist, I'm somewhat less optimistic about the ability of politicians to get to grips with these things. But here's hoping, and I do think with the election coming next year, now is the time to really drive these arguments as hard as you can and hope that the politicians pick up on enough of them to turn the dial a bit and start to make a difference. I think on social care, it's certainly an issue we'll be returning to at Reform Scotland in the coming months. We'd like to do more events. If you'd like to contribute to our NHS 2048 series, you can have a look on the website. You see all the articles and papers that have been written for that. We're always open to more voices and new ideas. But really, just to say thank you for all those who attended. Thank you for your really intelligent questions, and especially thank you to you, Donald, for giving us your time today and sharing the benefits of your experience and expertise. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.